Here we are.
Yep, here we are. All right. Well, let's start by, I guess, where people are in the book, where everyone is. I'm finished with the book. I've read the whole book before we started, but Jer, where are you at?
Well, I just finished the Moneychanger today, so I'm just about where I was the last Hangout. I've done 1/3 of the suggested reading. Yeah, that's where I am, and I just started the next one. I think it's the Slave, right? After the Moneychanger.
Yeah.
Just started that one, but I'm really literally on the first page of that chapter.
So,
Yeah, I'll probably get that done over the weekend, and then the rest before. My plan is to catch up by the end. So, yeah, so that's where I am.
Okay. Marco, where are you?
Well, I've read through the Pilgrim, so I'm a good boy. I'm right on pace with the idea of 3 sections a week, and I could say more about my reading experience, but I think if I did that, then we wouldn't hear where Taylor is at. So
All right, Taylor, where are you?
I'm at the same place where Marco is. I did the assigned reading too. So yeah, I just finished the Pilgrim. I was really interested in the Pilgrim's character.
I know, the Pilgrim's my favorite.
Yeah, he's an interesting character.
All right. Well,
And you? Oh, you finished it. Yeah.
yeah, I finished it. I read the whole thing. So,
You're at the end and the beginning. You're at all points
yeah.
in the book.
All right. Well,
So,
I'm not really sure how to start. What to say?
Well, the last time we mostly spoke about the thief, right? Like 90%.
And then a
of
little
our
bit on the
discussion.
bride. Yeah.
A little bit on the bride. We didn't get too deep into the bride. Maybe we just touched on who's the third one there? Is it is it the chieftain? We may not have touched on him last week. And on the forum, Jeremy, you've posted 3 reflections on those first 3 first three characters, and there's been some discussion on those. I haven't really felt myself like I know exactly what to think yet. I mean, there's bits of language that really, strike me as beautiful or as intriguing. There's, there's. I'm seeing Ollie there, but I'm not. Can you guys still hear me?
Yeah, yeah.
Oh, okay. All right. Cool. Yeah. There's there's this kind of pattern, right, of characters coming to these points of transformation, right, and these sort of awakenings that they have, and there's each one of them seems to come to some kind of death, which is at the same time a form of awakening and a form of freedom and liberation, like in their own way. And some literally die, and others don't die, but like the Moneychanger becomes, disfigured, tongue cut out, and so forth. And the saddlebag, the notes or the scrolls in the saddlebag, has a message for like each of these characters. It's a message, interestingly, like that they receive even though they can't necessarily even read the text. Like the chieftain can't read the text, right? But he takes the scroll and he makes it into a little, I don't know, amulet or something that he carries around with him. And then he leaves his life behind. He leaves behind this heroic, individualistic, Nietzschean, yeah. That's probably not very fair to Nietzsche, but but he leaves behind this life and becomes a simple farmer. He grows figs or something, and sells sugared peaches or something like that, pears maybe. It's I've been reading, the way I've been reading the book is pretty casually. It's usually at night. It's usually like just before going to bed, and it's a nice way, for me to kind of go into a more imagistic and metaphoric and symbolic and dreamlike state, compared to what I may have been doing during the day. But I think that also has resulted in me not fully grasping all the kind of factual interconnections of what actually happens. Like, I'm fairly confused about the mix-up in the caravans in Jeddah before the bridal train and the corpse and the Moneychanger and the other, pilgrims, set off. There's some confusion at stop-go. There's various uproars and protests.
I don't think I fully understood the whole plot of everything until like pretty much the end of the book. I think that's almost intentional.
To me it was confusing, but I think it's partly also just the fact that I wasn't reading like studiously, sitting down kind of.
Okay.
I'm getting the I'm appreciating the different sort of personalities and characters and like paths that the author is presenting in these vignettes, and so I'm continuing to enjoy the book, and it's also for me. This is the last thing I'll comment. It's simultaneously disorienting and interesting to be kind of put in the midst of this convergence of many different religions and ethnicities and histories. Like, there's people from different from India, from China, like people that I'm not really familiar with on a everyday basis, and I haven't traveled in that part of the world, and so I'm having to go to like Wikipedia and learn like. I've heard of Uyghurs, for example. The Pilgrim is a Uyghur, right? And he's actually like Chinese, but he's Muslim, but he's also has this Buddhist dimension to him too, right? Like, and this Taoist dimension. So he's this weird like convergence of different religious, orientations and faiths, and so I'm learning. It's like educational for me, just to kind of follow the story and like. Want to become curious about the context for the characters' lives.
Yeah. I was, the forum has been sort of interesting because I feel like there's been Ed Mahmoud has been really, is that his last name?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Has been really making some interesting posts. I don't know if you've been checking those out on the forums, but he's been making some interesting comments. But we were talking a little bit about the Chieftains chapter, and I mentioned on the forum, I feel like I get the sense that, so he was a Wahhabist, like I guess that was like the religion that he most identifies as, but he doesn't like actually believe it. He has like no actual faith in like anyone but like personal power, I guess.
Mm-hmm.
And I was thinking that I was kind of like drawing the parallel between that and terrorism and that sort of thing. I was thinking like the author might be playing with like the roots of terrorism, and how that kind of grew out of this destabilization, especially because you kind of get it later on, but there's like some like imperialist, colonialist powers that are like kind of screwing things up in the region at the time, sort of like background noise in the story, but you don't get to that until like the Dervishes chapter. But so I was just thinking about that as well, because he's like this guy that is pretty much, so he's definitely a sadist, and and he has like this, he only has faith in himself really, and he sees everything very like practically, and like I don't know, it's just kind of like putting that in the context of the way that these modern, even just leaders in general, that world leaders, that they don't really believe in anything except wanting more power. There's no belief system there except the desire for more power, and that seems to be his belief system is power in and of itself, worldly power. And then I think being confronted with some kind of power that he was not familiar with and that he recognized as completely overwhelming his own power, and realizing how petty and small it was, I think it like completely broke him. That's sort of how I interpreted it. What did you think of the chieftain?
I think your connection to like Wahhabism and sort of the Saudi Arabia exporting of Wahhabism, which has been talked about a lot in contemporary like political science and journalism, is pretty much, I think it's on point. I don't know if it was intentional or not, but certainly like his sort of non-belief in anything supernatural and his use though of the supernatural, of omens, and knowing that like his followers were extremely superstitious, and knowing that he could sort of use those things for power rather than believe in those things himself, I think is very much like maybe commentary on sort of like political corruption in those in the regions, maybe back then and also today. So that was very interesting. I liked, and I guess you brought up the Nietzschean thing because of the will to power that Nakhjavani mentioned. So I figured she's probably borrowing a little bit from Nietzsche, but it was all about like the will and personal desire and personal power. And yeah, I mean, like, you know, the chieftain, like all the other characters so far, have a kind of, I wouldn't necessarily call it entirely secular, but it certainly is more worldly, more egoizing in its orientation. Each character, whether it's their survival, whether it's their dominion over the desert, or their sort of like, for instance, I just finished the Moneychanger. You know, his rebirth, becoming these different people in order to survive and sort of make his way up through the world. He could be anything, you know, like again it's a using of sort of belief and superstition and religion and culture to kind of shape-shift his way into success. So all of these characters have this kind of world-oriented philosophy with their lives, and except for the bride, of course, which is interesting. But the bride is kind of just like one of the, so far for me, is like one of the more unique characters. But the rest seem to have a kind of more world-oriented philosophy that gets shattered by whatever happens to them in different ways, too. For the chieftain, it's sort of like his will to power is drained. For the Moneychanger, he kind of just, for the first time, confronts the divine. He doesn't seem to be denying it. He just seems to like not bother, and like that's not what he wants to do. It's not what feeds him, so he avoids it. But even he like figures out sort of karma, interesting themes around karma and reincarnation, and kind of escaping the wheel of samsara in that chapter too that I really liked. So yeah, I don't know. I'm kind of just rambling too about sort of the initial observations that I had. But the only other thing I brought up on the forum was the story of sort of like how this like divine consciousness, or this encounter with a divine being, or just a simple like a divine encounter, can sort of transform somebody, especially somebody with power and with worldly power. And that's kind of like a ongoing theme and motif that I've seen in a lot of stories.
There's a quote from the chieftain which I think is really interesting, and what?
Oh, we're gonna.
Why are you? Anyways, the chieftain had reverence for writing, that he could not, though he could not read himself. He had learned that writing meant knowledge, and knowledge gave power. He was not illiterate in the language of power. He could read it in the eyes of men and the bodies of women. All his life he had wielded it, and now was it wielding him? Which I thought was kind of an interesting commentary on writing and the word as well. And it was like a divine encounter, and to a certain degree, other than the thief who actually encounters the writer of these scriptures that they're encountering, they're all just encountering the word. They're not even encountering like a being, or like having their own kind of transcendent. Well, I mean, they do, but like it's always through writing, through this. And like you were saying, Marco, not all of them are even literate. The chieftain isn't literate, and somehow it's reaching him. So
it makes me think of Jeffrey Kripal's studies on literacy and language and religion, like sort of the hermeneutical basis of reality, which he brings up that point a lot. Are we writing our own lives, or are our lives being written? And is mystical experience sort of a way to begin to author ourselves in a way that we haven't done before? So he plays around with that kind of like hermeneutical level of language, and it seems to be a major aspect of, like you're saying, throughout each chapter. This sort of language and hermeneutics seem to kind of be like in relation to power and maybe divine power. Like, are we authoring ourselves, or are we being authored by something greater than us? And can you really get away with thinking you completely author yourself in this world? And what does that mean? What kind of language, what kind of authorship do you have? Is there another level of hermeneutical reality that's actually authoring you in a bigger way? Which seems to be what the characters are all learning. They're like, I know the language of the desert, but then this other language kind of that writes the desert's language.
And he knows the language of power, so I feel like, and the bride knows the language of her visions, I suppose.
And even the Moneychanger, he knew many tongues. He was all about his tongue, and his tongue gets cut out. So there's a lot of symbolism around language and speaking. It's really interesting.
And losing their own powers in a way. So I suppose the bride just comes to sort of the fulfillment of her powers. But anyways, I don't think we got to Taylor. Taylor, where are you? How have you been doing with the reading?
Good. I think we should let Oliver talk, though. Or introduce himself for where he's gotten. He hasn't gotten to talk yet.
Hey, Ollie.
Hey, guys.
Well, we know how far he's gotten.
You get the...
Yeah, you can guess how far I've gotten.
How far is that? 0? Oh, come on.
I haven't even gotten it in the mail yet, actually. I was expecting to get it sooner. Apparently, living in Canada and ordering a book that's rare means you got to wait 4 weeks, apparently. So, and you got to pay 5 times the price.
Well,
but I've still been absorbing it, and it's fascinating to me. Actually, it really reminds me of this study called Dramatica, also called StoryMind. If you go to StoryMind, all one word.com, there's a whole plethora of stuff you can read about it. But the whole notion is that every story is really composed of a single mind observing the whole structure unfold. And that's a way that you can kind of develop a story. And it seems like, from what I'm hearing, it's almost as if normally you would have a character like protagonist or antagonist, and they kind of balance each other out. One can't really exist without the other. And so not just antagonist and protagonist, but there's all kinds of other polarities that once you kind of organize them, it all makes sense. And I'm kind of starting to see how it relates to the structures that Gebser talks about. But that's kind of where I am right now, is just holding, these different structures, these different theories, these different ideas for how to approach a story, and seeing the way that the story is being told, like in vignettes between the characters. So that notion you were talking about earlier, Jeremy, about the idea of a singularity, it's all taking place around a single event. Right. So the story mind is the mind that's capable of perceiving that entirety as it's unfolding. So, yeah, that's where I'm at.
That sort of like sends me on a whole...
Go for it.
Sideline, but not really, because beyond the language aspect, beyond the hermeneutical dimension here, there's a singularity that's taking place. And in itself, because I'm thinking like, all right, we have this hermeneutical dimension to the book, we have this singularity dimension to the book about millennialism, like sort of the whole idea of a new avatar, some kind of new age, some kind of transformation that's about to take place, and the characters themselves are sort of in a kind of gravitational way orbiting around this instance,
right?
How that transforms them. In a way, it's just an interesting way of thinking of transformation, and especially of cultural transformation, where people are moved by something that maybe is more hermeneutical in its sort of an ontological status. Yeah. Like, this ties to Gebser, certainly. Like this mysterious merchant, right? This mysterious person who authored Notes in the Saddlebag is kind of like this structural mutation, this bifurcation point that everyone is turning around it and being moved by it and influenced to it, whether or not they want to. It's kind of like a good way to think about and personalize a connection to social transformation. Like Gebser was talking about it too. Is it something that oh goodness, he used this kind of language throughout the book, but the whole idea, like does it move us, or are we move? Do we move it, or are we moved by it and through it? Are we fulfilling it, fulfilled by that singularity? To me, is an interesting connection to what you're bringing in with the singularity and Gebser and structures.
Yeah.
And the primal point, I mean, that's a phrase. You hear that mostly with Pilgrim, I think. But it's a phrase that gets repeated throughout the book. So there is this idea of like the singularity, the primal point. It's like, and also just the book itself is like there's a center point, and then everything is, and then there's also a sandstorm. So like the sandstorm, like the very center of the sandstorm is like the center point of the whole story. So like the sandstorm is sort of where all the events of the book kind of rotate around, and also this center point of the Saddlebag, which is during that time even in the middle of the sandstorm. So there's like this, there's like this center point, and then there's like everything's like a sandstorm. Everything's kind of rotating around it.
Right.
Giant movement of things. I think that was intentional on the part of the author to use the sandstorm as kind of as an image for that kind of movement and change.
Yeah. Yeah, that's really interesting. You're reminding me a lot of, I don't know if you guys know of Heinrich Zimmer's King and the Corpse.
No.
Campbell used to refer to Heinrich Zimmer quite a bit. He was another comparative mythologist. And the basic premise of that is that's basically like a distillation. It would be a similar thing to what the Saddlebag was, but what naturally kind of came out of that area is the one story that was retold the most amongst all the tribes that were meeting on the Spice Trail. And the basic premise was there's a neophyte that has to carry a corpse from a tree to a ritual space. And as he's carrying the corpse is telling him stories that are basically the different stories of all of the different tribes as they've met. And every time the king asks a question about the story, the corpse ends up right back on the tree again, and he has to return until he's able to like hold the stories in his mind and reach the ritual space. So you see how this is the same kind of central theme of a central point and realization. Yeah. So
we saw this in some documentary on Netflix.
Frouds did it, and I'm a huge Brian Froud, Wendy Froud fan.
Okay.
They did Labyrinth and The Dark Crystal, and
yeah, they did a stop motion version of it, I think.
Yeah, it was amazing.
It is.
It was a really good documentary.
This is what Saddlebag really reminds me of, is that same story, but it seems like it's coming out of a single voice, right out of Nakhjavani's voice, which is interesting because in the whole idea of, I think, Baha'i faith and monotheism, the fruition of it is a single voice speaking the whole tradition, so that everybody can hear the story at once and be on the same page, essentially.
And in the Baha'i faith, there's definitely an understanding of unity in multiplicity, unity in diversity. So that is definitely a theme within the book as well. Like there's these very, very different characters coming from all over the place, and meeting at this central point. And that's theologically, that's sort of one of the kind of foundational ways that the Baha'i faith sees the world. So it has been interesting. She's kind of masterful, really, in the way that she's tied all of these things together.
Yeah.
Many, many different ways. It's like using lots of different devices to tie the ideas of diversity and unity and this primal point together. But speaking of which, you were talking about millennialism, and that's kind of an aspect of the book we haven't really kind of touched on yet. And it's sort of like a theme that is really subtle, though. She doesn't really touch on it that much. But in the Moneychanger, she brings up the Kalki Avatar, I think, once. So,
Avatar and the Yuga and the turning of the age. So the Moneychanger, I feel like that was like a big part of his transformation, which is feeling like he himself is at the cusp of these two different ages. He's the embodiment of the Kali Yuga, being this kind of trickster merchant, and then his transformation losing his tongue, but also being sort of like offering himself into this new age as somebody who can transform through his deeds and through this devotion. It was a big part of the Moneychanger. So for me, it didn't really need to be spelled out. It didn't need a whole conversation about millennialism. Just having that old sort of half crazy mystic dude in the marketplace kind of tell him the Kali Yuga.
I tell you, he has come.
And the avatars come. Like that was enough to really kind of sink in with the whole primal point, the singularity, the saddlebag, and then even the bride too. The bride had this kind of millennialist, like that for her, like it was first person experience of this sort of divine angelic encounter and this transformation of the world, and she got to be at that singularity, that primal point. For her, she died in ecstasy because of that kind of visionary level of experiencing it. So it's like, to me, it's just sort of implicit in at least those two chapters, how, millennialism, but maybe not spoken about as...
And it's also, I mean, regardless of any theological implications the book might have, it's also just like an undeniable historical aspect of the 19th century. Like millennialism was just rampant, like pretty much all over the place, especially in the Islamic world and in the Western Christian world, particularly like new Protestant movements that were cropping up at the time. There was I think I'm trying to think, the Seventh-day Adventists, like their prophet had like literally bought a horse and like went to Mount Carmel and was like waiting for Jesus to come like down on Mount Carmel, and she's like had 2 horses and one was for him. Like, that was the like level of belief and fervor of the return of Christ and this millennial spirit. So there's, and also in I'm not as familiar with the Sunni Islam, but I know in Shia Islam there was like a whole millennialist movement again that was going on as well, which you'll read about a little bit in the priest's chapter of the Mahdi coming. Like they felt that he was going to come. So there was like a lot of different, and I don't know about like the Kalki Avatar, and if there was any talk of that. I know that since then there's been a lot of discussions of Maitreya and the Kalki Avatar and in like Hindu and Buddhist communities, like in the 19th century and then the 20th century and now the 21st century. They're still talking about it. So definitely an interesting theme historically that's going on in the background, and she comments on it a little bit. But yeah, I think it's something to think about when you're reading the book. There's just like this like underlying like feeling of expectancy that's like pervading the whole region, and really 2 worlds, the Western world and the at least the Middle Eastern world. So I'm
kind of curious what Taylor has been thinking.
Yeah, I know we've been not giving Taylor enough time to speak.
Cool. Yeah, your discussion on language earlier, the Arabic language is very stratified. It's like there's root words. There's roots within roots. So you can delve into the meaning of a word and discover multiple roots within that word. So the idea that there's some kind of primal force guiding that process of articulation is pretty common sense with Arabic. One of the reasons why I really want to study is to discover those meanings within meanings. And I think that's also important when we're talking about identity, because if you have a name, for example, and you don't know the meaning of your name, then that's not going to inform your identity very much. So in my opinion, it's important to have knowledge of what is the meaning of your name and things like that. And but that's very blatant in Arabic, because there are meanings within meanings given the structure of the language. For example, the Bab identified 360 root derivatives of the word Baha, and that was like this huge. And I think he shared that with Baha'u'llah, and that was like a correspondence they had. This is according to Abdul Baha. Yeah, just there was this This is an important facet of the Arabic language to keep in mind, I think. The other thing that I remembered was when I was reading about the Pilgrim, who was a monk in Tibet at some point. I remembered the tradition of termas, and a terma is basically like a hidden treasure that contains scripture, and that's a Tibetan tradition. But I feel like the saddlebag is almost a terma. It's a terma of sorts. And it was interesting because I had a dream several nights ago that I discovered a terma like this, like a hidden scroll, and it was actually in like Arthurian, like French, like romantic script, and it was like this beautiful, like harping on like the Arthurian legend or something. But I think this idea of like sacred scriptures that are like hidden, like presents almost for you to unravel, is kind of a central theme of this text almost. It's something that might be interesting to consider, and the idea that you can discover these things, these hidden scriptures, without discovering a physical, tangible object. Like they're scriptures within yourselves. These hidden gems are within us. So there's a lot to study there, I think.
Yeah, and I think since there's like 3 Baha'is on this, even though I think we were in a majority Baha'i talk last time, but to go a little bit more into Baha'i studies, the whole idea of writing in the Baha'i faith is like a huge aspect to the faith, because in the Baha'i faith, Baha'u'llah and the Bab were the first manifestations who actually wrote down their revelation. So before, we've had oral traditions talking about what the Buddha said or what Jesus said and that sort of thing, but not the actual manifestation, which is the word for like prophet or avatar in the Baha'i faith. So writing, and also in Arabic and Persian culture, writing has so much more, as you were saying, Taylor, has so much more levels, depths of meaning. I almost regret not being able to read the original scriptures in the language, because there's so many subtleties that you lose when you try to translate it. That's true of the Quran as well.
Yeah.
So that's something I was thinking about too, kind of contemplating, is like this Arabic and Persian conception of language, and how the author, coming from a Persian background, and a Baha'i background, is kind of conceptualizing the power of language and the power of the written word, because it's such a more in-depth and spiritual conception than someone from America might have about the way writing. I mean, yes, Americans like kind of recognize the power of the pen and the power of the written word to some degree, but in Persian culture, it's like it has this whole mystical component that I just feel like isn't really necessarily a part of the belief systems that maybe I grew up with, or some of the other people reading the book grew up with. So I've been trying to keep that in account while I've been reading the book. But that's been, and then thinking about logos and that sort of thing, and thinking about etymology, and that the Gebser reading really like broke my mind open in terms of. I think we've.
There we go.
Okay, yeah. Kind of broke my head open in terms of etymology and what you can pull out of etymology. So, but yeah, that's true. I mean, there's the Bab is so the Bab in Persian means gate, and so it's the gate in this conception. This person would be the gate between the age of prophecy in the Baha'i faith, which is everything that was before this point, and then everything after is the age of fulfillment. But the Bab in his person would be the gate between those 2 ages. So people that aren't familiar with that, if think about that with the authors, what she's playing with this kind of stuff, it's interesting. It's a little curious. I don't know. I know Ollie's been since he hasn't had the book, he's been checking out the resource page, which I'm glad someone's using it, because I spent some time making that. So I'm glad you're looking over it. But what have you read so far, Ollie? Like, what have you been checking out in the supplementary reading?
The stuff seemed to be mostly from the same webpage. It was kind of organized early stuff, and then there was a couple of more academic readings. I thought what was kind of cool was the one report from a Western doctor who visited him.
Oh yeah, the Bob.
Yeah, who visited the Bob. I thought it's interesting what you said about writing too. One thing you didn't mention is how fucking prolific his writing was during the time that he was alive. Like, he must have just written 24/7.
Yeah.
Because it's
almost
endless.
a miracle in and of itself.
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah. It's just what I thought when I encountered it too. He just seemed to be really intense. We talk about intensity of time. You know, with Gebser, he certainly was exhibiting something like that.
He was actually a very young man. He didn't live very long. I think he was martyred at 33. So if you think about, I mean, the level of writing that he did in the time that he did. And he was also not, I mean, he was a merchant's son, so he had a comfortable upbringing, but it's not like he was raised by people that were like encouraging him in any sort of way to write or have that kind of thing. He was really expected to just be a really good merchant, which by all accounts he was a very honest merchant. I think he pissed some people off, which is also in the supplementary readings if you guys want to check that out. But
yeah, that notion was really cool. The way what did he do? He broke the tradition of refusing a deal after it had been settled. Not refusing. What's it called? Refuting or renegotiating.
Yeah.
Basically reneging on the deal. Yeah.
But that
put the kibosh on it.
There was like the breaking down, and that's sort of in the Moneychanger as well. This idea that like old practices in the old age are like not going to be a thing anymore. It's like it's like getting rid of things that are old, and that's actually something I recognized early on, just in terms of just the idea of social transformation, the idea of planetary transformation. There are two wells. And one well is old and crumbled and dried up. And then there's a new well that has just been dug that has this really clear, refreshing water. But the water source is the same. So I was thinking about that. She just does it all over the place. She just plays
really cool.
this idea of renewal all over the place. But I don't want to overwhelm the conversation. So I don't know. Jeremy, why don't you talk for a while, or Marco? Let's let Marco talk.
Well, Marco.
It's like tag team here. You got to tag in, Marco.
Well, I'm thinking about future viewers who might be watching this, and I think it's probably be a good. Like I actually started reading. I read one or two of the links on the resources page, so I learned a little bit about the Bab and about the persecution of Baha'i. You know, in that time, I didn't get far enough to really feel like I have a grasp on like the basics of the history, but I think it's relevant, right? So I mean, it's part of like the actual intellectual context, right, and spiritual context of the book. So I mean, could you do like a quick sort of overview? You know, like what is you know the Baha'i faith, and how does it relate to the book, or like broadly, you know, like that? I think that would be useful to just kind of like document and like, you know, put out there.
I was thinking about doing that. I didn't want to like stifle people's conversations of interpreting the book however they felt they wanted.
I think we got to get back to the book too, like and just, you know, like do the more like close reading. But I think this is part of even being able to do that, like clearly.
For sure. I mean, so who wants to tackle that? Any one of us could probably do it. Jeremy, you've never really had the opportunity to give an introduction. Maybe you should practice.
I got an idea. Since you guys are practicing Baha'i, like, why don't you tell me about your own personal encounter? Like, how did you first decide that Baha'i faith was something you wanted to pursue and follow? What's the story behind that? Rather than looking at the Bab, let's make it personal.
Well,
with that, as far as you want to go.
Marco wants an intellectual context for the book, though.
Oh yeah, I'm just kind of trying to provide some neutral sort of container, you know, for the discussion.
That's the thing. It's like it's one of those things where it doesn't have the when you are a Baha'i or like any kind of Baha'i work, it's not like someone where you know people just automatically know the basics. Like most educated people would know the basics of Islam, Judaism, and Christianity.
Yeah.
You wouldn't have to feel awkward and like you're like, going to be proselytizing if you got.
Well, it'd be like trying to talk about Teilhard but not knowing about Christianity. Like,
yeah.
Like what? Okay, so what is the tradition? This is.
Tell me about Christianity. What's that about?
Right. So that's interesting though. You have to fall back on that as the context.
Yeah. Yeah. Right.
So that this would be like a way to like go about how to approach talking about it, rather than just like you could just read the page off.
Well, I frankly knew nothing about Baha'i. I didn't.
Yeah. Look at.
I vaguely knew that it existed. Like the word was not totally foreign to me, but I really didn't know anything specific about history, belief, like anything in that sense. So this is totally an introduction for me, and it's very interesting. Like it's intellectually interesting to me, and it's also, like part of your guys' lives, and so we're here intersubjectively, and I'm interested in that in you. So
it would be most useful probably for the two integral Baha'is here to give like kind of an introduction through sort of how it sort of is kind of work. I mean,
we're a rare breed out there.
I just feel like that would probably be the best way for at least.
The path is straight, but very wide.
Oh. You've never had to do this before. This is
well,
unfortunately
I had
the
a
burden.
podcast.
That's true. Yeah.
Taylor, do you want to take a shot first?
Yeah, why don't we let Taylor do it?
I just feel like we've been talking the most. I'm not trying to.
I feel like I'm always, whenever I talk to other Baha'is, I feel like I approach it like I'm a complete ignoramus and I know nothing. And I find whenever I do that, I learn a hell of a lot. So I'll try to keep my
hand back off to us again.
No. I just try to like siphon off all the knowledge I can from you and plead my ignorance, and I learn a lot in the process.
I don't know. I just I felt like you had some interesting insights I hadn't thought about before. Okay, so now that we're all done patting each other on the back,
I'm just talking the very, very like basics, like kindergarten, preschool.
Why don't you go? Jeremy,
like who the hell's the Bob? That's like a weird name.
Okay, the Bob.
I know
it sounds like
Bob.
David Lynchian.
Yeah.
It sounds like, I think Twin Peaks. I think Twin Peaks. The
People
Bob.
joke about that all the time. Like,
oh, Bob.
Yeah, Bob. Yeah.
The Bob. Oh no.
So
go ahead. Do it.
There's like these two characters. There's like this event that happens. There's this persecution that happens. And then there's this kind of tradition that has been born, right? So.
I mean, historically, the basics are okay. So in Persia, in Iran, in the 19th century, and in the 18th century, there was this in terms of religious history. There's been a really interesting tradition of millennialism and this belief in the Mahdi, basically, which. For Shia Islam, as opposed to Sunni Islam, which I don't really think has this kind of understanding, it's basically that there can be another prophet, there can be another age, there can be a kind of religious renewal which is imminent. And like the whole idea of like Christ coming again is a very similar thing in Western culture, but in Shia Islam and the Shia and the Muslim world, this was a very powerful belief. And a lot of people in that region were claiming to be the Mahdi or the next manifestation, the next avatar. And it's kind of interesting too, because if you go further east, if you go to China, there's been also a history of people claiming to be the Mahdi or the what's it called, the next Buddha.
Maitreya.
The Maitreya Buddha. So there's like there's this history of this next Buddha, this next manifestation, and basically, in the 19th century, the Bab was somebody who claimed to be this next manifestation. Only he ended up gathering a very large amount of followers. I guess they're called Babis, right? Mm-hmm. Thousands of followers. And he was a prolific writer, extremely occult. And he wrote about, like, there's new systems, there's new time. Marco, you and I we talked about that previously for one of the Gepser Hangouts about new forms of time, he created an entirely new calendrical system. So it was this sense, he was a prolific writer, prolific, in some ways very occult in his sort of understanding of writings. I'm not as familiar with the Bab because basically when he was martyred, when he was killed by, was it the Persian government?
Mm-hmm.
Was it
yes, it was the
Ottoman
Persian
Empire?
government.
Persian. He was martyred, probably just for obvious reasons, heretical reasons, and sort of creating.
Well, he was getting a lot of attention. I mean, he was gathering a lot of people around them, and they were also calling for like total revolution, basically. I mean, total change in society, right? Like he had a woman poet who like hung out with him, and she.
There's this kind of almost like the early days of Christianity where there were these saint-like figures surrounding this person.
They're called the Letters of the Living, just to bring in the
more language. Letters of the Living. So these early followers basically believing that the Bab is the gate, this new world, this new transformation, and it was for the planet. Basically, after he dies, one of his very close followers, I don't remember his...
He was one of the Letters of the Living too, Baha'u'llah.
But Baha'u'llah.
His name was Mirza Hussein Ali, I believe.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Yeah.
And basically, he comes forward, and I'm pretty sure the Bab left the context for this, basically saying, like, I'm not going to be the last dude. Like, I'm going to write some stuff down for you.
No,
but when he comes, like, listen to everything he says.
It's called The One Whom God Shall Make Manifest.
Yeah.
Which was actually the... if I take over.
Yeah.
So the Bob's ministry was
he was almost executed too at one point, and like he disappeared, and he's talking to his secretary or and then he's like, all right, now you can execute me, and they execute him.
Execution.
That's the story. Yeah.
The Bob's execution is really weird. If you read the accounts of it, and it's not just Bobby accounts; it's like actual like Russian soldiers that were like totally third party that saw it happen as well. But I won't get into that too much. But
okay. He teleported, basically he teleported.
Basically, I mean, so what happened is he was killed by firing squad, but the first time the firing squad fired on him, after the smoke cleared, he was sitting up on the ledge of the wall behind him without any kind of bindings on him, and no one's really sure how that happened. And this would have been and when Jeremy first heard this story, he was like, well, that's a really interesting like example of like modern mythology. And I was like, no, it's like not mythology. There's like 2 other accounts from like non-Babis that were talking about this. It freaked everyone out a lot. And then a lot of people in the firing squad didn't want to continue after that because they were so freaked out. But regardless, so his whole ministry, his whole dispensation in the Baha'i terminology was talking about a new age starting, this new age of not just like Persia, not just Islam. He literally started a new religion for pretty much saying the entire world has been transformed. Like the entire world is changed now, and there is going to be this next manifestation shortly after him called the One Whom God Shall Make Manifest, which he didn't name him specifically at the time, and so he had a very short dispensation, as they say. A dispensation in the Baha'i belief is like how long a religion has primacy in the world. So Christ's dispensation would have been probably about 1,400 years before Muhammad in the Baha'i conception. But
not even. I mean, Islam was like what, 400 years after Christianity?
In any case, so however long it is before another manifestation comes is how long the dispensation is. So the Bab's was literally like not even like, I think about 19 years altogether, which is a significant number in the Baha'i faith. But in any case, Baha'u'llah is one of the followers of the Bab, and afterwards claims to be the one whom God shall make manifest. And the Baha'i faith is unique in that it's basically recognizing that there's this planetary transformation that was initiated by the Bab's martyrdom. The Bab was necessary in that he was like this primal point, right, between this old age of the world and then this new age that we've entered into.
I think a good analogy for this is sort of like St. John the Baptist and Jesus. Archetypally speaking, they have a kind of relationship where one announces the other, but it's understood that they're kind of like dual
twin manifestations.
avatars.
Yeah.
But what's interesting historically is that, when Baha'u'llah claims he is the one who is made manifest, there's some like arguments about who's going to be the one. There was some arguments with his brother and a couple of.
Well, his brother never claimed to be that.
Ultimately, he basically created the same kind of like political, social unrest. So he was kicked out of Persia, and then he was sent to Constantinople. But the Ottomans didn't want him there either, because the Persians were threatened by the social movement that the Baha'is and the Babis were creating. So they kicked them out further to Palestine. Basically, he lived in exile for most of his life, and as a prisoner, actually, in the small island of, what was it called?
Akka.
But like the Baha'u'llah wrote prolifically for like decades, and they still haven't translated all of his works into out of Persian.
They won't be able to do it all.
Thousands of pages. So like the Bab, there's a kind of hermeneutical dimension to his writing. But basically, I mean, it was really Baha'u'llah who kind of articulates this sort of planetary transformation and a kind of esoteric conceptualization of sort of like human evolution being moved and guided by these avataric incarnations through history.
There's an idea. So there's a understanding of the evolution of consciousness in the Baha'i faith that is probably one of the earliest examples you'll find. It's definitely not as I don't want to say complex, but it's different than maybe you'd find later with Teilhard and that sort of thing. But But Baha'u'llah basically talked about this nascent global civilization that was going to emerge in the next 1,000 years or so. This global peaceful civilization. There's like this global government. There's this change in the economic system. There's an auxiliary language. There's all of these things he talked about that would eventually come to pass before the close of 1,000 years, which is how long he predicts that his dispensation would last before the next manifestation, which there's always more manifestations. But I think the cool thing about the Baha'i faith is that in the 19th century, in the middle of the 19th century, there's this religion that is envisioning this planetary civilization that's nascent in the world, that's already nascent in the world. Like he was saying that just within the writings of the Bab and the martyrdom of the Bab, the seed was planted for this nascent global civilization.
It's kind of like, if any geeks out there are familiar with Rudolf Steiner's work, Steiner believed there was a kind of inner body of the earth which transformed according to this sort of avataric succession, which sounds very similar actually if you read a lot of these kind of evolution of consciousness mystics in the late 19th, early 20th century, very similar kind of principles. What's interesting is, of course, the Baha'i faith precedes it by half a century, but it's this idea that there's already been an inner transformation, and sort of everything on the outside, the physical world, is being moved by this thing that has already happened, which again is very similar to Gapester in his sense of like this integral structure. It's already happened. Time has already erupted. We're reacting to these things. We're trying to catch up. The world is being revolutionized by something that's happened in a kind of esoteric or inner dimension. So the quickening has happened. So that's I guess that would be a synopsis. But and it's interesting because it imagined a global civilization, esoterically oriented, and understood about an evolution of human consciousness, a spiritual evolution. And this was in the 1840s, 1850s, which is so fun to think about that.
I think another thing, if I may add, is that the Bab was constantly referencing this person who was about to come. And another interpretation of the name he chose, the Bob, for himself, is that this manifestation would, as if stepping over a threshold, enter the new world and bring about a total transformation. He said that this person who would come had total responsibility to annul whatever laws he set forth and to edit whatever he wished of the law according to his own will. So he saw it himself as the corner, in archetypally, like you said, Jeremy, sort of like St. John the Baptist. He's referred to as the herald of the Baha'i faith. So, yeah, and I think in terms of how that fits into integral theory, I think integral theory is a good academic and intellectual partner to the Baha'i faith. That's the way I've seen it. But yeah, I think there's a lot of rich soil there for conversation to happen between these two communities.
I know, that's kind of what we were hoping would happen.
Yeah.
We picked this book intentionally, hoping that we could get some integral people to start, which we did. We got Marco Morelli to start talking about the faith. So we already achieved our goals.
Ed too. I mean, naturally, like I think the you could see what Gabester would call structures of consciousness, right, at play in the book, and you could see sort of the magical structure of consciousness and the mythic structure of consciousness and the mental, and I'd be curious to explore like how you see those correspondences between the aspects of the Baha'i faith and particularly that are being represented in the book, and what let's just stick to Gabester because we actually like read him and we have like a body of conversation around him, because integral theory could we can go in a lot of different directions. Like the chieftain, if we talked spiral dynamics, he's obviously like red, and the thief maybe purple or whatever. But so let's just stick to Gabester, since that's our lineage here. Do you see particular correspondences then between what Gabester is describing in terms of this, aperspectival world and eruption of time and the emergence of an integral structure of consciousness, and what the Bab or Baha'u'llah were articulating themselves?
Well, that's a good question. Yes, immediately in the book, I mean, we've talked about the structures a little bit already, with the thief mostly, kind of the transition from different forms of literacy and how that kind of corresponds to, alphabetic and script medium versus a sort of oral culture and the shift from like the magic to the mythic or the mental. I think that's interesting. But in terms of integrals, the integral structure, the diaphany, I think that's the most interesting question, because this primal point, the singularity, this mutation, this omega point that's sort of described in the book, and is experienced by each character, and I'm going to reference the Moneychanger just because it's the one I just read, this whole idea that it sort of comes without you realizing it. Like, it's a day like every other day. There's a passage that he reads from the Saddlebag where it's like, the sun will rise and set like any other day, and that's why people miss that singularity that happens, which is a kind of, it's not just sort of like an avatar, but it's also a singularity. It's an event. It's some kind of transformation. It's a shift into a new age, and I think that's kind of interesting, and it speaks to what Gabester was talking about too. And I think what he took a few hundred pages to try to articulate is that, in the midst of everything that seems totally normal, something profound has happened, and there is a shift that's taking place. And I can't point it out in any one thing, but I can evidence it in this piece of literacy or this painting or this new science. And there was this kind of like invisibility, this sort of invisible dimension to a singularity that you don't necessarily, it's not like literally, I mean, the merchant, the Bob, maybe, is this event, a literal person you can meet. But for most of the characters in the book, it doesn't really happen directly. It's a very indirect thing that's so world changing and so subtle. And to me, that's like a really good way to understand the structures themselves and how the transformations take place. It's not going to be something explicit. We're not going to be carried off into some step through a portal into a new world in a kind of literal way. It's not metaphorical either. I think the experiences in the book really defy both literalism and metaphor. And instead, again, it's this sort of hermeneutical in-between space, this liminal space. So I really like that about this book, because to me it's sort of like, this is what a structural transformation looks like. This is what mutation looks like. This is what the eruption of the achronon might look like. It's this kind of like really subtle thing, and it completely transforms you before you even realize it, because it has that kind of originary quality to it. And if anything, whether or not we think, that the book is sort of like a mutation into the integral or not, the mutation aspect, and Gipster talks about this all the time, origin shines through when there's a transformation, there's a dissolution and recreation. And time is different, and experience is different, and multidimensionality kind of rears itself in a subtle, delicate kind of way, but also extremely powerful and life-changing way. So to me, I think the strongest part of the book, the Saddlebag, is the experience of a singularity and transformation through that singularity, because of the kind of originary dimension that comes through. And of course, like you could say, okay, it's a new time, it's a new age. Okay, Integral's talking about the same thing to some degree. And in the context of the Baha'i faith, of course, like the Bab was literally creating new time. So you could definitely make connections there with Gapesar's work too, about new time, like a new form of time, or perhaps even like we've been saying with Gapesar, it's the eruption of time itself. It is time. It is showing itself in that singularity with the merchant, with the Saddlebag. Time reveals itself. The eternal reveals itself. So you could make that argument too, that like that is like a confrontation. A confrontation with the singularity is a confrontation with the integral. I don't know. That's just like that's my initial feelings about the book and connecting it to.
And what is your understanding of the Baha'i faith and integral? How does that work together for you intellectually?
I don't know. Esoterically, it makes sense. I feel like, again, it's sort of like in a mystical form, Baha'i faith is a sort of like, this thing is happening, and that primal point, like Baha'u'llah's writings and the Bab's writings, they seem to be sort of precipitating things that emerged 100 years later with the New Age movement and the counterculture movements, the 1960s and 70s that we're all talking about this transformation. So to me, it's kind of like going a little bit closer to that origin point, that sort of singularity point. And the fact that it speaks so well to everything that kind of comes through it, it becomes a kind of, I wouldn't say a mantra, but it's a way to kind of like see the world through. And it seems to confirm a lot that's going on in the world. Like 100 years later, like Thompson's talking about planetary culture, Wilbur's talking about an integral civilization. And to me, it's sort of like they're like the characters in this book, they're already moved by this thing, this inner thing that has already happened. And like Gapesar also talks about, like he himself, he's moved by something. He's being authored already by this thing. So to me, like it's an interesting, that's how I kind of make the connection. It's kind of like, what's the originary word that spoke this new structure into being? So I don't know. That's how I kind of intellectually bring the two together. But sorry if I ramble too much, guys.
No, that's really cool. I just want to make one comment, and that's that Gapesar does an interesting thing where he'll show how like structures kind of echo themselves, or there's a kind of harmonic, right? So, for example, like the gut of instinctual or like magic consciousness is kind of recapitulated in the brain, of mental, and like viscerally they look similar, it's kind of curving labyrinthine sort of shape, and it was occurring to me that the chieftain is sort of like almost like one of these like harmonics, like at this level where he's reading omens and like imparting meaning onto them, but also receiving meaning. Like he's interacting with the omens, the sandstorms, the flight of a bird. I mean, whatever is like in the environment, and then imparting meaning, which he uses to lead his to men and to terrify them and to entice them forward to do what he wants. But it's like a similar thing then happens at this higher octave, right? Of interpreting these omens, right? Gebser does that, right? He looks at works of art. He looks at innovations in theory or in poetry and so forth, like as these omens or these kind of heralds, if you will, of the integral structure, the perspectival, the achronon, etc. And it seems like the same thing is happening in the writings of the Bab and of Baha'u'llah. And you're kind of even as we kind of like look at these different manifestations, right, as thought forms, right? There's the sort of integral thought forms and all the various like hybrids of that, and then these more religiously rooted, I think, thought forms. Although the integral is also religiously rooted, just kind of drawing in different, it's sort of like abstracting and then drawing them into this, system, depending on the variety of integral theory. So it's like that. They are themselves like omens, right? Of something that we are in the process of writing, or that is in the process of writing us. And that's an interesting kind of whole question there of like how that's even working, because I've kind of recently become more, I guess, suspicious of just like giving agency to external entities and or even processes like abstractions, or so I'm like, I think that there's a truth to it, and like that has been almost my primary orientation, is like feel like divesting myself of egoic agency in order to participate in a greater agency, but one that I don't have a particular framework or narrative for. It's sort of like an emergent narrative that like I'm engaging as my as my way of just understanding what the fuck's going on in the world, and as my art, right? And so I guess it's just like I think that there's a tension there for sure. Like there's a tension whenever whenever a narrative concretizes, because there is because it puts us into the realm of then like actual like human relations and power and dynamics, and that's I think where like there's a lot of like just discourse that has to happen, and like understanding that has to happen, which is kind of like the idea of having different meta perspectives like talk to each other, is that they sort of work out, they come to a deeper self-understanding, but they also sort of kind of like, I guess they change, they make their particular boundaries more porous, and maybe better able to kind of communicate with other boundaries.
Mm-hmm.
I may have just been riffing there too.
No, when you start doing that, you start doing like, you go like this. You start riffing, you like get your fingers up and you start going like that. So I can always tell when you're like really getting into a thought. But
that's the Italian, and it's just
I know.
genetic inheritance. I have to talk with my hands. Okay.
Yeah, it's all right. Gesticulations. No, I'm used to it too. And Jeremy's, family's full of Sicilians too, so we get it. But yeah, I think one of the things that's been a relief to me as being a Baha'i is that I don't think I could be in any other religion and that is exclusive in the way that it looks at the world, in the sense that the Baha'i faith sees itself and sees all of religion and really all thought in general, any kind of human experience, as just a very, very tiny drop in this like infinite ocean of ultimate reality that we can never truly comprehend. But there's like this understanding that of the faith that there's that that we don't have an absolute grasp of truth. Like even the truth that Baha'u'llah wrote about or the Bab wrote about, we can't. It's not something that can really be fully grasped or fathomed. And even what this civilization that they were writing about, what it's going to look like. Like, yeah, we can try and talk about it, and before it's really as it's birthing itself, as we're watching it unfold, we can try and kind of predict what it might look like. But it's like someone in the Middle Ages trying to imagine what life would be like now. There are things that will be there that we can't, that aren't even, that they're just the seeds of those things. The printing press and the internet. Of course, the printing press was a nascent form of the internet in some form, but you could never take those many leaps to be able to get to the internet and the consciousness of someone from that era. So what I'm trying to say is, as a Baha'i, I feel like there's an understanding that, like that the Baha'i faith doesn't have it all figured out. We try to study the world around us and try to have an understanding of what's coming into being. And we try to understand that through the writings of Baha'u'llah and the Bab, and the other manifestations as well. And just by looking at the world, and there's also an understanding that the Baha'u'llah wrote something like you can never fully grasp the mystery of even the least of God's creatures. So even like the mystery of an ant, you can never fully grasp it at all. So how much more could you possibly grasp this new age that's come into being? Like, you can't, or anything that's happening around you. You try your best, but we're all just agents in it, but we can't fully understand what's happening. So I guess what I'm saying is that as a Baha'i, it allows me to take in everything, yes, from a framework, but recognizing that the framework is just that. It's just a framework. Like every religion that comes to pass is just a framework for trying to understand something that's ineffable. So I feel like having that understanding of religion, which is Baha'u'llah definitely talked about, allows you to look at religion as being both valuable and also something that you don't have to be dogmatic about either. And that's something I appreciate as a Baha'i, and allows me to come to understand integral from a way where I don't have to like dismiss it as, it's like, oh, I've got the Baha'i faith, I don't need integral. That's not how you need to approach the world. And integral is the same way. I mean, it's the same consciousness that we're seeing glimpses of in the world. And I do believe that it's the same consciousness that Baha'u'llah was talking about. I don't think the Baha'i faith doesn't claim to have a monopoly on it. It's something that is the inheritance of all of civilization, of all of the world, actually, all of the whole planet, the whole of creation. So there's just something going on. We can't possibly figure it all out. But looking at all of these different things and looking at the different ways people are trying to understand it has really been interesting. And I think that's probably the weirdest thing. It's kind of like we're talking about, quantum physics is like weird science, is like weird theology or weird philosophy, is like all of these like different systems of thought seem to be converging on something that seems like they're all looking, it's like that elephant thing where like the wise men are all looking at the elephant and they're all touching different parts of the elephant. It's like they're all coming to something similar, but you can't quite grasp what it all is, and you can only get a little bit of understanding by having dialogue with lots of different people.
Which is why we're all here.
Yeah.
I feel like though it's not just a framework, right? You call it a faith, and it's not. Then that's just something more than an intellectual kind of like theory. You know what I mean? Mm-hmm. It's interesting because sometimes I feel like people treat theories or meta theories like more than frameworks. Whereas they're kind of presented to be neutral, frameworks, but then the way people actually relate to them is as faiths. But I wonder if the opposite is also true. Like, what is the? I mean, it's like Jeremy, you said I thought it was interesting. It's like neither literal nor metaphorical, right? And it's like there's some different ground, where it's like it's real. Like the story is real, right? Like there's a reality to it that is prior to the abstraction, like into a meta framework, right? And particularly like when you live a story or when it lives you, like it's real, right? And like that, it's like a reality that's enacted. It's a reality that's embodied, right? I mean, people died, in the process of this. People died. Many people died. Many people were, persecuted.
Many people are still dying, actually.
Yeah, right. So okay, yeah. So there's like a flesh out dimension to it as well, and that sort of is like directly transmitted, like from person to person, mind to mind, body to body. It's genetic even. I mean, there's there's some thinking about like epigenetics and how memories of your grandparents, like the traumas that your grandparents suffered, show up in you, and it's so. I guess I don't know what I'm getting to, but it's like I get I guess the question that is interesting for me is like, where is that, like, and I ask this as an artist, like I ask this as somebody who like wants to bring forth an artistic vision, right? Is like, what is that reality that is neither totally literal, because I mean you can't, like you make up a whole new calendar and stuff, like there's some just invention involved, right? It's like you have to go and decide the names of the months, and you have to, figure out the mathematics of it all, and like there's a dimension of invention that goes on, and I would argue that there's an aspect of that, not the entirety of that is arbitrary, right? But not necessarily, because like then like the actual thing has to work. Like so whatever might be potentially arbitrary seen from one perspective actually has to be like really integral, like to the articulation. All right. So I'm using my hands again.
No. There's really cool stuff about the Baha'i calendar and the way that it fits into everything. Like there's when it was incepted and like the kind of perfection of like talking to Baha'i astronomers and stuff about kind of the way, like the things that happened with it and the way it's a very cool calendar. But you're right, it's still an invention, and I guess I'm not trying to say that it's not obviously it is a faith. Like I do have faith in it. But there's a transcendent quality to understanding that any understanding you have of your religion or you have of your faith is something that is just like it's trying to operate in this reality where ultimately like there's this thing beyond this reality that it's talking about that you can't fully grasp. It's like it's neti, like you can't fully discuss it, and even the manifestations talk about not being able to really articulate in words. They do a beautiful job as much as they can, but it's things that you can only know by. So I don't know, man. You got me in trying to talk about things that don't have words.
All right, well, just to get it back to the book, because there's the Pilgrim talks about like moving toward the uncreate, and like undoing these three like failures of his last day, where he fails to diagnose the exact, like he's perceptive, right? So he can like see what's going on and what people's natures are and so forth, and he ends up dying, right, in quicksand, and like kind of he loses his last tooth, and like he confronts his like most primal fear, right, his most primal fear of being, and it ends up in the uncreate. So it's it doesn't end in a system. Exactly, right? It ends in a singularity or point. But yeah, I guess what's I guess one interesting way we might be able to kind of, I don't know, forward the conversation, and I'm curious to hear from Taylor too, is that we've been talking about sort of the kind of bigger systems and sort of prophecies for like the planet, but the book, it doesn't, and that's like in the subtext of the book, right? I mean, it's sort of like presence, but subtly, right? But what really happens is all these personal transformations. So I'm curious, like, from the Baha'i perspective, like, what is like the personal transformation that is occurring, corresponding to the planetary? And maybe since we haven't heard from Taylor in a while, maybe he could address that.
Sure. For me, like, one of the reasons why after, I'm a very, like, for me, it's like, one of the things that I enjoy about my faith is that there's this, I can sort of participate in, like, I feel like there's this, like, bridge that the Baha'i faith created between West and East that allows me to really participate in Eastern metaphysics and how that affects my body, and like just the ideas of of tantric energies and things like that, while still being rooted in a monotheistic tradition. And I think that's pretty rare, to have a relationship with God, but still be amenable to these ideas, which a lot of Christians or Muslims find not kosher for dogmatic reason X, Y, or Z. So that's one of the reasons why it's really a powerful tradition for me and why I chose it ultimately. Yeah, but I think the best way to just improve your understanding of it is just to read the scripture itself. It's not a framework. I understand what you were saying, Natalie, but I do agree with Marco that it's not merely a framework. I think integral is a framework because integral is a secular theory, and there are so many integralists who treat integral as if it's a religion, but it's not. Religion, as a cultural phenomenon, is about transmitting a covenant that people come to together with their creator. And I think that's what the Baha'i faith is for. It's a religion just like any other religion. You can follow the covenant if you're a Muslim, you can follow the covenant if you're Christian, but you only can do that through following your religion. So, and the covenant is like a living thing that we all participate in. It's like this organism that we all are a part of. There's this like this metaphor of the crimson arc, and it's a metaphor for the heart. That the arc of the covenant is the heart itself, and that goes back to like the ark of Noah, and like the ark of the covenant that Moses carried through the desert. And so it's, I read some of the literature and I feel chills in my body, and I feel like these winds are like carrying me through these modes of thinking that that I'm not familiar with, So I would just, right now I'm flipping through, this is the Hidden Words. It's a small thin book that my mom gave me when I was in high school, and I read it every now and then, and it's a lot of the scriptures just really stuck with me. But I'm not encouraging you to abandon your critical thinking at all, and that's the thing that I actually enjoy about the Baha'i faith. But you have to understand the limitations of a secular framework, and you likewise have to understand the limitations of purely religion. And so that's why I'm kind of seeking to have this marriage between the two.
And you're writing a book on this, right?
Yeah, and I'm writing a book on. It's part of a trilogy that I imagine. The first book will be, it's called The Secular Gods, which is about secularism and coming to a true articulation of what secularism is. The second book will be a book called What is Integral Theory, which is basically just an introduction to integral theory, because I hard to come by, and a volume that is just simple and precise as to what exactly integral theory is, because there seems to be so many articulations of it. And then the last book will be about would be called One of Glory is the tentative title, and be about the subtitle would be An Integral Perspective on the Baha'i Faith. So,
wow,
that's the idea. I'll have to put in some sweat for it, but yeah.
Yeah, anything you want to write. Got metapsychosis as one of your mediums to explore some of these ideas.
Thanks. Yeah.
Yeah.
I think we started getting back to Ollie's question too, a little bit, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, a little bit. Yeah. Is there like the thing is like my understanding of my faith has deepened and in some ways simplified, and in some ways become more complex over the 7 years now I've been a Baha'i. And I don't feel like I can easily like convey without you guys having some background in some of the literature where we could talk back and forth about it. But probably, as Taylor was talking about, this understanding of like Eastern conceptions, like Baha'u'llah has this mystical text called the Seven Valleys, and the last valley is called absolute nothingness, and that's like the final stage in like the seeker's journey is absolute nothingness. But it's also a way of talking about this kind of union with the divine. But the divine is also thought about as, so God is also thought about as personal, but also there's like this thing above the personal God, which is like this ultimate reality. So there's, I don't know, there's just so much to the faith. And again, there's literally a giant building in Haifa, Israel, that is just filled to the brim with things that the Bab and Baha'u'llah has wrote. There's not one, I can't tell you, like there's
no singular holy text. There are important texts that have been translated, like the Kitab Akdas, right? Mm-hmm. And then a few others, but there's no singular text. I mean, if there is a singular text, it's the body of text of both of their writings. But the one thing I probably would throw in here to tie it back to the book, like we're talking about the Baha'i faith, we're talking about Baha'u'llah's writings, the Bab's writings. Reading, you mentioned the Seven Valleys, you're mentioning the, what was the one that you have, Taylor?
The Hidden Words.
The Hidden Words?
Hidden Words, yeah.
That was your first book, too.
There is an element to reading Baha'u'llah's writings, which I think ties into the books, and encountering a text. Encountering a text as a mystical experience, I think, is like a very important part of the book, but also encountering Baha'u'llah's writings. In a similar way, if you've read Sri Aurobindo, or even if you've read some of Wilbur's passages, there's a kind of gnosis. It's not just an intellectual grasp of ideas that can take place in the practice of reading, that I think is important here in the book, but also if you read the Seven Valleys, it's a contemplative reading experience. It brings you through. It brings you into something, in the same way that the encountering the Saddlebag brings the individuals in the story into the singularity. They pass through it. It transforms them. So reading is a kind of contemplative and transformative experience. I think it's very intrinsic to Baha'i faith, because it's not just a framework, it's an encounter. Mm-hmm. And Henry Corbin talked a lot about this too. Arthur's not here, but I'll probably bring this up next time a little bit better than I can. But Arthur brought up Corbin last time, and Corbin talked a lot about, in Persian mysticism and Shia Islam, there's an important dimension of angelology in this idea that your encounter with the divine is a personal encounter. And it's not the same way of saying, like, oh, you have a personal relationship with Jesus or something like that. It's more that the divine has a face, and it's infinitely more than the personal, but it sort of starts where we are. And it's this kind of conceptualization that even for, goodness, how to express that sort of like the divine encounter happens in these little personal singularities within individuals. And even God, in the kind of Ismaili mysticism in Persia, even God has angels who guide him. And sort of like there's always an angel up ahead. There's always a singularity, this turning point of kind of infinite cosmology that just goes on forever without any ending. So there's a deep mysticism, I think, to this like personal encounter with a text and with a singularity. I think it's very important for me anyway in understanding the book. And
It's
also,
interesting because people like they always have a story of like when they've encountered, a certain like writer, a certain body of thinking. Like people have stories of when they first encountered like Wilbur's work. Like I certainly do. Actually I wrote like a whole essay on that, and it's the same. So that it was really beautiful how you put it. That it's not a framework but an encounter. I mean, like at the like lived level, that's exactly what it is. I mean, it's like this personal singularity. I think that's really beautifully put. I really appreciate you guys sharing. Kind of, I feel like I got a little religious studies lesson, and
that you really, the best way to understand the faith and even get a better understanding, your own personal understanding, is to read the writings, because the writings, as I said, like the writings are that they're like a very important aspect in the faith, and that like the writings themselves are like the framework. I don't even want to use that term anymore because integral people have a much different understanding of framework than I do. but they're kind of like the architecture of the faith in so many ways. Like they form the basis of the way that we understand the religion, and that's true of many faiths. But because there's this, Baha'u'llah actually wrote his own texts, and it's not like an oral tradition or not something that was dictated. Like there's this understanding of writing that is very holy, and the words themselves almost have like a spiritual potency that they wouldn't have if they had just been like written down by someone who had heard from someone else. No.
Architecture is a good word. I really like that actually, more than framework. Architecture implies sort of the artistry.
Framework is literally architecture, like frame. You make a work of.
Well, think of like cathedrals or any kind of holy architecture. I mean, that's basically, it's a cosmology. It's a divine cosmology, whether it's like revealed or kind of co-created by constituents. I mean, it's that kind of personal singularity that you have with the all of the all. And we all have our different ways of doing it, whether it's like Buddhism or Islam or Christianity or not, or religions of no religion and kind of the counterculture, California mysticism. Like there's all sorts of ways to kind of encounter it. So I think talking about it in terms of structure and architecture is helpful in the sense that your understanding, it's not just intellectual, it's kind of like an imagio mundi, like an image of the world, and the only way to encounter the divine is through an image of the world. And you can maybe go through that. Maybe there's a kind of unknowing that takes place, but it's sort of like it's where you start, and it's what can carry you into it. You need it. It's kind of like bringing back to Corbin, it's the idea of this mesocosm, this imaginal world. You need the imaginal. You need the architecture. You need the cathedral or the meditation posture as a kind of bridge between you and the unknowable. And it takes you there. It lets you traverse that untraversable sea through belief and through the power of some kind of structure. So there's a kind of, and again, it's interesting. It's real and it's unreal. Is it us? Do we imagine these things? Are we imagining ourselves to an encounter with the divine that is real? I don't know. But
I don't know.
I don't know, guys.
Spin that one out.
What is reality? Yeah. Who's writing a book called that? Somebody said they were going to write on our Hangout last night. Was it?
That's a big.
J.F. Martell. He's writing a book on reality.
Yeah.
I'm writing a book on reality. I was like, I would never try to do that. I'm glad someone's trying.
That's cool.
Well, cool. This has been a very fascinating theological conversation, guys.
Yeah, that's the thing, is just it gets so frustrating because there's so many nuances that I have a hard time articulating, especially because I'm not as good about articulating verbally as I am through even through writing. But yeah, I think the best thing you could probably do is actually just study it for yourself. You'll come to your own understandings of it.
I think you all you did very well. I think you all did well articulating something that I found understandable and enlightening and edifying and interesting. So I hope other people pick up on that too.
But what were you gonna say?
Oh, I would just say I would recommend the Seven Valleys in the same way I would recommend reading like Sri Aurobindo's like Savitri or something. It's an encounter.
The Seven Valleys.
Yeah.
Okay.
So
who wrote that? Was that the Bob or Bob?
That was Baha'u'llah. The Bob's writings, we have a collection of them, but it's mostly Baha'u'llah's writings. You'll be able to, and you should probably go to reference.baha'i.org. Would be the official Baha'i library for writings where you can get everything.
We can send you the links. We can leave them in our show notes too.
Okay, that's a good idea. I feel like we should turn this into like a podcast or something like.
Well,
it was actually like a good discussion.
He's talked about doing a podcast with me about the Baha'i faith, but now that you're a Baha'i, it's almost like wouldn't be nearly as.
We can have a round table. We can have a round two with everybody.
All right. Well, I felt like there was like an energy that came through, like when we actually kind of just got to the I don't know, like it's the elephant in the room or something. Like, all right, well, this is a religious. I mean, we're talking about, we're engaging religiously, right? But we're not all, right, adherents or whatever you want to call it. So there's like a point there where it's, I think, a creative tension. I think it's like an interesting creative tension, particularly bringing like different meta theories together and frameworks with architectures, with encounters. It's I found it to be a really interesting mix.
Well, Marco, Abdul-Baha said that to be a Baha'i simply means to love the whole world and to try to serve it. So you actually already are a Baha'i.
Oh, thanks.
Newsflash.
Honorary, I hope.
Newsflash, you are a Baha'i. So. Yeah, I think anyone who's trying to build a planetary civilization that's peaceful and just is in essence a Baha'i in the most
Before we wrap up, I'd like to hear about the poet.
Tahirih?
Yeah.
The female poet?
Yeah.
Oh, yeah, I'm gonna take that one because Tahirih is my hero. Tahirih was one of the Letters of the Living. She was a very prolific poet, and she was a very accomplished poet. She was also a very accomplished theologian. She was brilliant, and she argued with like lots of mullahs and imams and that sort of thing, and she became very well known for her wisdom in the Quran. She was very well studied. She knew everything about it. And I think her father said something like, if only she had been born a man, she would have brought all this glory to our family, but because she's a woman, it's actually kind of shameful, the things that she's doing. And she became a Babi, and she actually was so fierce in her beliefs that she ended up leaving her husband and all of these things that were really horrible, seen as kind of horrible and during the day. And she also the Bab was revolutionary in many ways, but one of the ways he was revolutionary is by recognizing women as equal partners in society. And so there was the Babis were kind of formulating this new way of the genders encountering each other and working with each other in a different way. But Tahirih at the conference of Badash, which was this meeting of the Babis at one point to kind of figure out what they were going to do. The Bab was in prison, so it was kind of a crisis. She came to the conference unveiled, and Babis thought she was literally the second coming of I forget.
Fatima?
Fatima, yeah. They thought she was the second coming of Fatima, Muhammad's daughter. They the essence of purity, and everyone just to even see her shadow. It was Nabil, one of the other Babis, said for men to even look at her shadow, they would feel like they were being immodest to even see that. So she came to the the conference, she was unveiled, and she said something like, "I am the word that the Mahdi will utter on the day of resurrection." And anyways, it was so shocking to see her unveiled that one of the Babis like ran out of the conference and like slit his throat. He didn't like actually kill himself, but like Persians can be kind of dramatic in like in their religious experiences. So he like cut his throat. He was like, "How?" And then Qudus, which was like another letter of the living, was just furious with her, and they kind of had like this like thing. Like Tahirih thought that she like the Bab like asked her to like instruct Qudus because she didn't know what he was talking about. She was very like sure of herself, very confident. She would like strike down men in arguments all the time and like pretty much just humiliate them, and this was like just completely unthinkable in Persian society for women. And she was also just she pretty much didn't let anything stop her. But eventually like the way that she behaved in society caught up with her. And especially as a Babi, she was already kind of marked for death. So I forget exactly what happened, but she basically was arrested, and she was, I think part of it was indecency, but so they executed her, but she chose her own manner of execution, and she had them strangle her to death with her own veil, which is probably the most badass way I could possibly think of to die. And she said, apparently her last words were, "You can kill me whenever you like, but you cannot stop the emancipation of women," which is just like, and she also like, she went to her execution in bridal attire, which is back to the book.
So is she like the bride in this book?
No, she is not. Tahirih was not a crazy Zoroastrian girl.
Okay.
At all.
There's some like similarity though, right?
But the whole bridal attire thing, she went to her execution in bridal attire. So that's something to think about, is like thinking of martyrdom as a kind of wedding with your beloved, like you reuniting with your beloved, which is how she thought of it. And she also like rode up on this like white horse and literally like threw down her veil at the executioner's feet and like called him a drunkard. And then so she was one of the heroes of the faith, and she was just like an indomitable woman. She was like probably one of the most courageous women to have ever lived. And she was also just brilliant as well, and apparently and stunningly physically beautiful as well. Which probably didn't help her at all in the fact that she walked around without a veil. But I encourage you guys to read more about her, because she's just on her own, like in feminist studies and stuff, people write about her and her life. And she's often thought of as the first martyr for female emancipation, and female suffrage. So that's Tahirih.
Mm-hmm. That's very cool.
If you ever meet someone named Tahirih, they're a Baha'i. It's just inevitable. That's true of a few other names as well. Nabil, and
Badi.
And Badi would be another one.
Bahiyyih.
Yeah. So, but yeah, that's Tahirih. She's just an amazing woman, and she's mentioned in the priest chapter. So if you're about to come up to that one, you'll see her. You'll
sounds like a 19th century Persian, like Beyonce or something.
She's amazing. She was a superstar, I think. She was amazing. But her poetry is very beautiful. Her most famous poem is called Point by Point, I believe. So if you want to read something of hers, that would be the poem to read.
Cool.
All right. So
I guess for joining us tonight, everybody.
Yeah, I mean, not as big this time, but we still got to some pretty cool stuff.
Yeah.
Let's post some links for people. I don't know who's going to be watching this, but
somebody will eventually.
Someone, someday, thousands of years from now. But in some spaceship. But and then there's going to be another hangout on May the 6th, and hopefully, I feel like we need to promote that one a little bit more, because it's going to be the closing hangout, and we'll finally be able to get to like all of the whole of the book, which is really like completing a circle. So I feel like it's really like important to talk about the book having read the whole book, because there's like a whole understanding when it's when the cycle is like finally complete that you get from the book. So, and the corpse chapter is like, what? Like how are you gonna write it? Like before I read it, I was like, how is she gonna write about a corpse's perspective? It was like a very cool chapter. So I'm looking forward to talking about that. So yeah, but thanks for joining us, guys, and thanks for talking and everyone sharing. And Taylor, thanks again for helping us out with the Baha'i stuff.
Yeah, no problem. I enjoyed the conversation as always.
Yeah.
Thanks for hosting, guys. Great job.
Yeah.
Thanks,
Hold
Ollie.
space.
Yep.
All right.
All right. We'll see you later.
Have a good weekend, everybody.
All right.
Take care.
All right.
Bye.
Everyone.